Throughout history, few things have been more commonly predicted and more rarely eventuated than a short war. Often that assumption is built on the idea that because war is so ruinously expensive, no state could possibly carry one on for long. Indeed, it's reported that after the invasion commenced, many officials at the Russian central bank quit, because they knew what the war would mean for the economy they had spent years carefully developing. It wasn't long after the first salvos of Russian missiles began hitting Ukrainian targets in February that the West prepared its own volleys of economic sanctions in response. These were meant to be the sanctions to end all sanctions. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian foreign exchange reserves stored overseas were frozen. Western capital would be pulled out of the country, exports of critical technology into Russia would be throttled, and key export markets, primarily Russia's hydrocarbons, would be targeted. Like many sanctions regimes throughout history, it was slow to get started and full of exceptions, but at least initially, the results, the shock, seemed to be there. So around the same time, one Australian commentator was saying the war could go on for a while. Some Western governments were declaring premature victory. The ruble, they said, had been turned into rubble as the Russian currency collapsed on the news of both the war and incoming sanctions. On the 1st of February, 77 rubles roughly would buy a US dollar. On the 7th of March, that number hit 139. The Russian economy, some were saying, was on the road to imminent destruction. But at the same time, there was no shortage of analysis claiming Ukraine was also about to fall over. This was a poorer, less developed nation than Russia that was called upon to fight a major conventional war. Its economy surely could not handle the strain, especially with some of its territory, some of its industrial base, falling into Russian hands or being pulverized by Russian artillery. Of course, neither of those predictions came true, and here we are in January of 2023. Because just like so many governments throughout history, the governments in Kyiv and Moscow weren't particularly keen to just sit back and watch their economies collapse. There was a war to be fought and to be won, and as a result they intervened extensively to make sure their nations were ready for it. Nearly 11 months on, collapse has come to neither Russia or Ukraine. Both are showing signs of increasing production of key military resources. The Russian ruble was stabilised while many munitions factories went over to double or triple shifts in order to turn out the tanks, the shells and the other weapons of war that would be needed to sustain the fight in Ukraine. Ukraine, meanwhile, would see a dramatic economic contraction, but one that was less extreme than was originally predicted, and some sources are even predicting small growth for the Ukrainian economy into 2023. At the same time, it too is standing up some production capability for things like artillery shells. Inflows of foreign aid, as well as the acceptance of the civilian population of a lower standard of living, enabled Ukraine to transition towards a war economy, so that even as the economy shrunk, the Ukrainian military was able to expand in size many times over. It's illustrated a point that I've tried to make many times before, that industrial nations are incredibly resilient in their ability to carry on things like a war, and today I wanted to explore why. How can war be so expensive and sanctions and strategic bombardment so damaging, and yet these nations are able to carry on the war regardless? So to that end, today I'm going to give a brief sort of War Economics 101. What is a war economy? What is it meant to do? What is the conversion and mobilisation process that turns a peacetime economy into a wartime economy? And then I'm going to try and answer the key questions. Why do war economies endure longer than expected for just about every conflict that is recorded in our history? Why do they finally collapse, if they do collapse? And then finally look a little bit at Russia and Ukraine and how their economies are responding to the pressure. This is not an economic update video per se, but it should go far enough as to say the very basics, that both the Russian and Ukrainian economies have a lot of fight left in them yet. So first things first, what is a war economy? Kind of need to understand what one is before you understand why it survives and why it eventually falls over. And perhaps the easiest way to do that is to just give a quick simplified overview of how a theoretical war can go. So in most cases, you'd assume the countries involved aren't really economically mobilized for war before a war begins. But they do some defense spending, they have a military, they have some stockpiles, and in the early stages of the war, it's those stockpiles and that pre-spending that's doing all the work. It's the active duty army, it's the pre-registered reserves, it's the shells you had in your bunkers, it's the tanks and the airplanes you had already built. If all goes well for one side, then that may be enough. It may not be necessary to transition over to a war economy. And indeed, if you're the attacker, you kind of hope it is enough. If you are the one choosing to initiate a war voluntarily, then you'd hope that you've got good intelligence, good preparation, and you're only launching the war because you're reasonably confident that you're going to win and win quickly. In that case, you get a short, victorious war, everyone cheers, public morale soars, and the economy doesn't really have to endure much in the ways of shock, and you can go back to business as usual pretty quickly. That said, here's a fun activity for you at home. Find a military historian, ask him or her how often a short and victorious war turns out to be short and victorious, and then the game is to try and figure out whether they are laughing or crying. From the days of the Roman Empire to the Falklands War to the Russian invasion of February 2022, plans for a short war don't often pan out. War is a two-player game, so if the defender, like the Ukrainians and so many others throughout history, decides to fight back hard, it'll quickly become apparent to an attacker and a defender alike that their pre-existing means aren't enough, that they don't have enough equipment, manpower, and inputs in order to win the conflict. At that point, a war becomes attritional and a race for production. Well, production and forced generation at the very least. Most modern nations don't just keep enough materiel around to win a multi-year drawn-out attritional conventional struggle. During peacetime, most citizens, most taxpayers will accept the idea of funding some sort of military, but they also like things like improving living standards, jobs, schools, hospitals, food, Netflix subscriptions, you name it, and as a result, the budget for the military isn't unlimited. The idea is, once a war breaks out, a nation will convert its economy to produce more of the things that you need less of during peacetime and a lot more of during wartime. If America wanted to spend 30% of its GDP on defense full-time, the US Navy could cruise around the world with 50 nuclear aircraft carriers, for example. So if the initial phase of the war hasn't delivered a clear victory to either side and both want to fight on, it becomes a game of converting as many national resources as quickly as possible into combat power in order to unfreeze the conflict and switch from an attritional phase to a decisive one. And when we're talking about resources here, we're not just talking about cash, although cash does matter. We're talking about labour and human capital, the work of the various employees in the economy and the skills that they have. Financial resources like cash, but also borrowing capacity. Productive capital, so the factories that you have, the machinery you have, the infrastructure you have, and strategic resources. Oil, iron, rare earth metals, inputs into critical constructions that your nation either possesses or can get its hands on. A very crude way of describing a nation's resources might be the reference to GDP, gross domestic product, the overall size of the economy, but it's really not that simple. Some economies are better suited for the conduct of a war than others, and there are intangible factors. I'll add one big one that we'll come back to later: motivation. But the core point here is it's not just about how big your economy is, it's about how much of your economy you can turn to the conduct of war and how motivated you are to win it. To illustrate the point, lovely New Zealand has a GDP roughly 10 times the size of North Korea. But as a country, New Zealand is pretty chill. It's long on tourism, natural beauty, and agriculture, and short on, fanatical militarism. So if some space magic suddenly bolted New Zealand to North Korea and a war broke out, then the 9,000 odd active duty members of the New Zealand Defence Force might have a hard time stopping the roughly 1 million Korean People's Army troops, who have more artillery pieces than the Kiwis have defending soldiers. The North Korean economy is pitiful, but it's on a permanent war footing. Give New Zealand 5 years' notice that it's going to be magically teleported and then invaded, and the result would probably be very different. So what generally happens when a nation goes to war or expects to go to war and has to convert its economy from a peacetime footing to a wartime one? What is involved in mobilizing an economy and converting its resources into combat power? At its most basic level, converting to a wartime economy is about redirecting all the inputs that go into your nation's GDP and converting them to the creation of war-enabling outputs. So civilian capital, say a factory that produces cars during peacetime, can become productive military capital. During World War II, for example, Soviet tractor factories are converted to produce tanks. A lot of American war materiel is produced by the big peacetime car makers, General Motors, Ford Motor Company. And they don't just build new factories, although they certainly do that too. Production of civilian vehicles, like civilian cars for the American civil population, declines dramatically during the war years as labour and productive resources are converted to producing things that are useful for, fighting the war. As well as converting physical capital, you also need to take full advantage of your labour force. Anyone that isn't producing something that is vital to the economy or vital to the war effort, maybe that person either goes into the military itself or goes into the factories to produce more war goods. War economies during major conflicts tend to have very, very low levels of unemployment associated with them because it's just a waste to have someone sitting at home not doing anything. Get that person into a factory, onto a farm, behind the wheel of a truck or hucking a rifle, anything to contribute to the wider war effort. Financial resources are sort of the third thing that gets converted, so the money that the government has saved or that it can raise through things like debt instruments or money printing. A government might try and balance the books during peacetime, but during war there's usually more pressing concerns. The money tap turns on, and as a result, funds can be converted into imported goods, new capital, more employed people. Now, different countries throughout history have had different models of handling this economic conversion process. How do you get the various producers in the market, how do you get the civilian population to redirect their efforts towards producing goods that are directly going to impact your ability to win the war? On one hand, you might embrace the Soviet model from World War II, which consists of going to all of the factories that the state owns that produce things like civilian vehicles or tractors and telling them, guess what, you produce tanks now. And if the factory administrator remarks that he doesn't want to build tanks, he or she would rather their factory continues to build tractors, well, then there's probably the crack of a gunshot, and then the new boss announces that the factory will in fact be producing tanks. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have something more like the American model where companies are allowed to make profit, they're allowed to tender for contracts, compete against each other in order to bid for and win contracts to produce war material for the government, although even that has some pretty heavy-handed government intervention involved. And then you can have hybrid models in between, like the German early war military production model from World War II, wherein you have such wonderful, very German phenomena, like hand-stitching the leather seats on fighter aircraft even though there's a war on. I won't go into it this episode, but the myth of German industrial efficiency in the early war years is, I would assert, a myth. But mobilizing an economy is more than just telling all the factories that they make tanks now. It's about maximizing labor productivity and output. And as a result, a lot of the rules that apply during peacetime in order to maximize living standards or competition often won't apply during wartime. For example, there might be regulations on the ability of workers to strike. There might be loosened regulations on working hours and tightening of wages to keep inflation under control and push longer shifts. Firms might be forced to compete on intellectual property. So, for example, when Boeing designed the B-29 during World War II, the US government didn't want Boeing to be the only firm manufacturing the bomber because America wanted more of them. So Boeing was forced to share the design with other companies so they could manufacture them as well. That's not something that would generally happen during peacetime. When Northrop Grumman wins the contract for the B-21 Raider, Uncle Sam doesn't turn around and say, cool, give the plans to Lockheed Martin, they're the ones who are going to build it. And indeed, government might even get down further into the weeds and just divert resources towards the highest priority industries. There might be firms out there that still want steel in order to build civilian cars, for example, because no one else is doing it, so the profit margin is there. But the government goes too bad so sad and diverts the steel to the tank industry instead, because it would be kind of awkward to have to explain to the army that the reason they're not getting any tanks is because some guy needs his limo. One big example of government throwing the free market out the window in terms of resource prioritization might be the Manhattan Project during World War II, which famously yielded the atomic bomb. This was a fabulously expensive initiative that involved a lot of hard choices. And as a side note, the difficulty involved in getting fissile material and building an atomic bomb with 1940s technology is one of the reasons why I've never really bought into those alternate histories wherein Germany or Japan or some other country gets the bomb first. Realistically, America is the one with the resources to make it happen. The calutrons, which are mass spectrometers that were at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that were used to produce enriched uranium for the first US atomic bomb, Little Boy, those required something like 14,000 tons of silver to be used in their rails. But that's what the scientists and engineers said they needed, so the American government went to the Treasury and said, cough up 14,000 tons of silver. And I focused a lot on government intervention to mobilize an economy, but it's important to note you can also see informal conversion, where societies self-mobilize to an extent in order to prepare themselves for war. Civilians can raise funds or provide support to the military directly. They can crowdfund for drones, for winter equipment, and deliver it. We've seen so much of this in Ukraine. It might take the form of factory workers voluntarily working additional hours or voluntarily reducing consumption of electricity or growing food at home, any number of initiatives that civilians can take upon themselves in order to ease the conversion of the economy towards supporting the war. I have lost track of the number of times I have read Ukrainian or Russian sources that focus on the critical role that volunteers have played in this conflict. Many of the little quad-rotor drones that military units use on the front, those are provided by civilians, by volunteer organizations. When a farmer sees an abandoned Russian tank and decides to take it under tow, that's informal conversion, that's self-mobilization. When local retirees cook lovely meals and take them out to the troops to warm them up at night, that's informal conversion, that's self-mobilization. And it's vital because it can fill gaps that governments miss, answer requirements at a small level, at a local level. But it's only possible if the society has the level of motivation to call upon people to do it. Perhaps the most extreme cases of economic mobilization and conversion that we have ever seen in human history occurred during the Second World War. For most of the nations involved, this was very much a winner-take-all struggle. If the consequence of defeat would be complete subjugation or even enslavement and annihilation, then you're not going to spare any effort. All major combatants would dramatically increase their production of military equipment. Planes, tanks, trucks, guns, munitions, over the course of the war. But there's one interesting note that I want to add here. The degree of mobilization, so the percentage of a nation's GDP that was converted to the war effort, or the percentage of a nation's adult population that was put into uniform or war production services, doesn't necessarily track with how radical we would think that that country's government was. Germany dramatically underutilized women in war industries. Indeed, in terms of percentage of GDP dedicated to the war effort, Britain was actually one of the leading powers, spending as much, according to some estimates, of 50% of its GDP on the war effort. In 1939, Britain would produce 8,000 aircraft. In 1940, 15,000, overtaking Germany. The government in nations like Japan were determined enough, fanatical enough to expend manpower in suicidal attacks. In the war's closing days, there was a determination that the home islands would be defended, even if troops only had simple bamboo spears with which to defend it. But the Western Allies were determined too. It was just that determination manifested in mobilizing almost half of the national economy to make sure that when their troops went into action, it was with a significant advantage in weapons and equipment. In 1944 onwards, German troops would often complain that American units were unwilling to advance until they had received significant air and artillery support. For the Americans, that was the idea. But all of that just goes to what a war economy is. A conversion of peacetime resources and assets towards the production of all the things you need to win a war. It doesn't explain why they endure so long. How can nations that always seem to be 1 or 2 years away from a financial crisis at any given time suddenly manage to survive just fine when they're suddenly spending 30, 40, 50% of their GDP on defense? Throughout history, you'll often see countries continuing to increase and ramp up war production even as their overall strategic situation, economic conditions deteriorate massively. By 1944, I'd argue Germany has already lost World War II. The strategic bombing offensive is ramping up, and yet it is the record year for German World War II war production. The Russian Empire in 1917 is about to collapse. It is approaching revolution. But production of artillery shells is going strong, especially compared to the early war. Japan during the Second World War was having its cities sequentially leveled, and yet war production did carry on with some disruptions. Russia now is facing an array of import controls, sanctions pressures, but production of a lot of systems has likely increased, things like tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery ammunition, and Ukraine has lost a huge share of its GDP, and yet it is sustaining a much larger army than before. How is it possible that under extreme pressure, time after time, National economies managed to meet wartime requirements. France during World War I, the Soviet Union during World War II, where much of the Soviet Union's most populous areas have been occupied, factories and workforces have been physically dragged brick by brick on freight trains behind the Ural Mountains, and yet production still increases. The Axis powers of World War II, who endured terrible bombing. There are even other examples if you go further back in history. One little known example that I like to bring up is Paraguay during the War of the Triple Alliance, where Paraguay fights basically all of its neighbours at the same time. Terrible idea. In that war, it's estimated that Paraguay may have lost the majority of its male population, and yet the war only ended when President Solano Lopez was killed. Now, my argument is obviously not that modern Russia is willing or capable of losing 34 million citizens in this war and still prevailing, but instead that history provides many examples of countries enduring despite extreme hardship. And when war economies collapse, they do so for specific reasons. And indeed, in many cases, the collapse of a country during a war doesn't necessarily mean the collapse of the economy. The country may be physically overrun, it may have been functionally defeated, it may be a popular capitulation where the population decide that they're not into this whole war thing anymore. We'll talk about all these in detail later on. The point is the nation just needs to get to a point where it is either not able to resist or unwilling to do so. And Perun, you're probably saying, get to the point of explaining why they don't get to that stage very quickly. Why didn't Russia and Ukraine not just both go bankrupt in March or April and declare the war over? The first reason seems obvious but is absolutely vital. Most of what a developed, industrialized nation produces in terms of GDP is not stuff that is critically necessary to just sustaining life. Ancient societies like the Persian or Roman empires didn't have very high GDP per capita, but they were most of the time able to produce enough food and enough buildings and shelter to ensure that people had the very basics, that they could survive. As an economy develops, it spends money and develops more than just the basics. A person earning $1 a day might spend 80% of their income on, say, food and fuel in the country in which they live. An American earning $250,000 a year doesn't spend $220,000 a year on food and fuel, I hope. Instead, hypothetically, the economy starts producing more goods and services that improve our qualities of life. Air conditioning and heating, more advanced healthcare, access to the internet and telecommunications, vehicles for transport. And for many people, this is the core goal of economic development, to improve the quality of life, to enable people to consume more goods and services that enable them to live a life that is closer to the one they want to live. But the flip side of that is that the wealthier an economy becomes, well, the more of the economy is producing non-essential goods and services that can afford to be turned towards the war effort. If tomorrow the production and consumption of $4,000 designer handbags ceases, well, no one dies, no one is in mortal danger, but GDP does decrease. It's just that that decrease doesn't really mean anything for the war effort. It just means that no one in my society gets to consume expensive handbags. If you shut down half the speculative hedge funds on Wall Street and start handing rifles to finance bros, GDP might decrease, but again, no one's going to die, and suddenly you have a good supply of additional infantry. And since that last measure has created the demand for Lamborghinis and sport cars, if I then convert those factories to producing military vehicles, again you might see a GDP contraction, but not an increase in unemployment, not a decrease in wages, and an increase in the ability of a country to produce. And so what you can see happen during wartime is that society does suffer economic shocks and economic damage, but it compensates for that, or more than compensates for that, by pulling back on the production of non-essential goods and services and focusing on what matters in order to win the war. Again, the massive reduction in the production of just family cars during World War II in the United States is a solid example of this. The next point, which is equally obvious but seems to often be forgotten, is that nations can also just expend resources that they have saved or available to them, or they can essentially mortgage their futures in order to draw things out longer. The simplest examples here might be a nation spending its savings or accumulated resources. Russia, for example, went into this war with thousands of armoured vehicles, artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition in its storages saved up. it's now expending those. It hasn't necessarily converted GDP to meet the requirements of its war. It's spending its rainy day fund of military equipment and ammunition. It's spending part of its inheritance from the old Soviet days. Once those resources are expended, they're gone. But it takes a long time to expend them. When you're talking about financial resources, nations can borrow, nations can print money. We're going to go through some of these fiscal strategies later on, but nations can do a lot to expend the resources available to them to carry on. During the Second World War, Britain raised billions of pounds by selling state-owned assets and investments. Right now, Russia has a national wealth fund in which it had saved quite a substantial amount of money, and that's going to support the budget deficit moving forward. Now, of course, none of this is without a cost. Once you've expended the resources you've saved, well, you can't expend them again in the future. Russia choosing to expend a majority of its long-range precision munitions or use up a lot of its reserve vehicles and reserve ammunition means it can't then use that to threaten other countries or to deter potential aggression in the future. Those resources are gone until new financial resources are found and spent to replace them. And those financial resources might be harder to find if the savings have been expended and debt has been run up. If interest payments become a greater and greater share of a nation's budget, for example, it can be harder to find funds for critical things during the reconstruction phase. Britain would only repay the last of its war debts to the United States on the 31st of December 2006. And the sheer cost of borrowing during the First World War meant that Britain would spend much of the 1920s spending more than 8% of GDP just on interest payments servicing that debt. But at the same time, winning the war would have been impossible without taking on that sort of debt. War consumes resources, even if those resources are only on loan. And all of this comes together with that soft factor, which is the will of a society to endure. During peacetime, this is a gross generalization, but stick with me. During peacetime, most citizens of a country want their government, generally speaking, to deliver economic prosperity, to make their lives better, or convince them that their lives tomorrow will be better than their lives were yesterday. Societies may want to see higher wages, lower taxes, better education, better healthcare, new infrastructure, better access to telecommunications and the internet. All of these things can become public expectations that politicians campaign on. And even in countries where they don't have public elections, still often you will see autocratic governments focusing on delivering some sort of economic prosperity, a promise of improving living standards to their people. But while I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that take a very dim and cynical view of the average member of the voting public, throughout history, most people tend to understand that during a war, their expectations need to go down. Peacetime Americans would probably riot over something like gasoline rationing, but wartime Americans have historically supported it. During peacetime, you would expect labour unions to push for the maximum possible wage increase and to bitterly oppose anything that would, for example, increase working hours without compensation to go along with it. But history is full of examples of unions agreeing with government to keep wages under control and to push hours up during wartime. A government that would be turfed out if there were systemic losses of electricity or internet access during peacetime might receive incredible popular support during wartime if those outages are a result of enemy bombardment and missile attacks. This will to endure doesn't necessarily produce more tanks, guns, or shells on its own. What it does is it enables a war economy to focus more on those critical outputs, less on the comfort of the civilian population, and yet still persist. And in terms of the ability of a nation to actually win a war, well, it acts as a multiplier on everything else. If country A has an economy half the size of country B, but is willing to dedicate 3 times as much of its resources towards the fight, well, then it's still going to be able to outproduce country B, all else being equal. But the citizens of country B will be able to enjoy their jet skis, Lamborghinis, and lower taxes right up until the moment that the troops of country A raise their flag over their capital. So, it all balances out. This is why it's so hard to separate something like defense economics from politics and popular will. We can intuitively understand the idea that an outnumbered and outmatched military force might be able to win a great victory over a stronger one through smart tactics, heroism, or Hollywood writing. What might be less immediately intuitive is the fact that a country with fewer resources might be able to field more combat power and more military resources than a much wealthier one. See my New Zealand versus North Korea example. The percentage of your national resources that you choose to mobilise, both in peacetime and during a war, that's a choice. To an extent, the amount of hardship that you're willing to inflict on your own civilian population, the sacrifices that you're willing to make now and in the future in order to win, to an extent, that too is a choice. And while it might be, all else being equal, easier for a wealthier nation to spend a greater percentage of its budget or mobilise more of an economy for a war effort than it is for a poorer nation, because more of the GDP is focused on services, luxury goods, etc., that doesn't mean that relationship always holds. In relation to the Vietnam War, the leader of North Vietnam and the communist there, Ho Chi Minh, is famously quoted as saying, "You will kill 10 of us and we will kill one of you, but in the end it is you who will grow tired of it." The same concept applies to economic sacrifice. Over the last half decade at least, depending on the sources you read, Russia has spent a greater percentage of its GDP on defense and security than countries like the United States have. That's despite its economy being much weaker than that of the United States. That means the sacrifices represented by that spending and that preparation, well, they're all the more painful. It means we're talking less about few designer handbags, Lamborghinis, and jobs for crypto bros on Wall Street, and more the fact that a majority of Russians in rural areas don't have indoor toilets. Now let's be clear, gross poverty exists even in the wealthiest of nations. America has its problems with access to critical services, with homelessness, and with inequality. But the invisible burden paid by the average American or the average German or the average Brit or Australian is much lower than the average burden realised by the average citizen in Russia, and certainly a heck of a lot less than the cost realised by someone in North Korea as a result of that country's policy of putting the military first. You don't build nuclear weapons as a nation with a GDP of 25 billion US dollars without making some pretty unconventional budget priority decisions. And that point around popular will ties in with perhaps the biggest reason that it takes a long time for war economies to burn out. It's the fact that governments generally don't want to sit back and just watch their economies implode, and they have a lot of tools available to them to stave off collapse, to keep an economy going. So really, the question of how long a war economy can endure comes down to the strength of an underlying economy and the willingness of politicians and people to make increasingly difficult decisions to kick the can of economic collapse down the road. There is probably no way to configure a contemporary economy to be sustainable spending 40 or 50% of its GDP on defense, but there are plenty of mechanisms government can use to hold it together just that little bit longer. And when the alternative is surrender or abject defeat, often governments are willing to make those choices. And there is perhaps no way to explain this better than working through a purely hypothetical example. So congratulations everyone, you are all now officials at the Department of Victory. Our nation is at war, we've invaded a neighbouring country, and unfortunately all the old officials got very depressed and quit, so guess what, we're in charge. Your mission is pretty simple, deliver victory, or more specifically, deliver the military all of the goods and services it needs in order to secure victory while holding the home economy together. And you have a problem in front of you, a first problem to solve in your first week on the job. War is very expensive and the government is running out of money, so fix it. Now, before someone goes dropping the entirety of their remaining national savings on Tesla shorts or their latest crypto coin of choice, the first thing we need to do is diagnose how bad the problem is. There are a variety of approaches to funding a war that are available to us, and depending on how bad the financial situation is, we can choose more and more extreme measures. With crypto investments obviously being the option we take up after we've considered unconditional surrender. Please note the crypto and stock market jokes in this video do not constitute financial advice. But anyway, the politicians have decided to go to war. Our advice that this is a stupid financial decision has been ignored, so let's make it work. Now, if you are a very wealthy country, or it's a very small war, or some combination of the two, we at the Department of Victory may not have to do much at all. We might be able to fund a war essentially as business as usual. Maybe we increase taxes slightly, maybe we reduce services that we provide to the public to free up some additional funds for optional defense spending, or maybe we just borrow at ordinary peacetime rates. The markets aren't spooked, they know that we can pay our bills, and as a result, they don't really hike interest rates, so we're still borrowing at 2, 3, 4% per annum, and we use this to fund our war for however long it might take. A real-world example of this might be the American Expeditionary Wars from 2001 onwards, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The average American wasn't really called on to buy war bonds, there was no real economic mobilization, it was just a admittedly very expensive additional line added to the budget year on year that increased the national debt. Now, make no mistake, this is still a very real cost. I'm not saying that a war in this scenario isn't incredibly expensive. Those trillions of dollars could have been either reduced from the national debt, given back to the population as tax cuts, or used to create productive infrastructure or provide services. Instead, what I'm saying is we can fund the war without any gross reorganization of our economy, without any extreme measures. We can go on essentially as normal. Of course, unfortunately for us at the Department of Victory, our politicians are very brave. They don't pick unfair fights. They've picked a fight with a significant opponent that will require more funds than are readily available in an ordinary budget, and so we need to look at option 2. If the resources available to us today are insufficient to fight the war, well then what we can do is essentially borrow from the future in order to fight the war now. Sustainable spending is for defeatists, and we are in the business of victory, and there's a variety of ways that a nation can fund itself beyond sustainable spending. The sale of state-owned assets, taking on international debts at elevated rates. If people are worried about our ability to pay our debts, well, they'll still lend to us if we agree to pay 15, 16, 17, 20% perhaps. There's going to be someone out there that's willing to offer us a deal. Maybe we do optional war bond purchases where we ask civilians in our nations to essentially lend money to the government in exchange for interest payments in the future. And if that doesn't work, we can do compulsory war bond payments where everyone has to buy war bonds with a percentage of their wages. After all, the civilian population of our nation probably has a lot of money saved in their banks, they're probably earning significant money in wages. The government needs that money right now, so they should be encouraged or required to lend that money to the government. Or we can just, tax them to space. Another way to do this, if you don't want to be seen to be pushing war bonds onto your population, is the World War II German model. There, the banks take in deposits from ordinary working Germans as normal, and then the government politely explains to the banks that they should hand over those deposits of real money in exchange for promissory notes and bonds from the government. In this model, the ordinary member of the public never needs to be involved, never needs to buy a war bond. They just need to put their money in the bank as normal, and then the financial institution will generously handle the rest in cooperation with the government. And if that sounds at all underhanded, I would like to remind you we are literally talking about Nazis. Now that handles some of the income side of things, but we also need to reduce costs so we can divert more money towards the cause of victory. Deferring maintenance or investments is a good example of how to mortgage the future. If we don't maintain roads, factories, water infrastructure, power infrastructure, it's probably not going to start breaking down immediately. It's going to have to be maintained at greater expense in the future. We're going to have to do remedial maintenance as well as just preventative maintenance. But again, that's the future problem of future bureaucrats writing a future budget. Here and now, we can reduce expenses on these areas. Another way to reduce costs might simply be to just tell people that we're not going to pay as much for stuff. Price controls on goods that are required by the government, production quotas for labour, or barriers on increasing wages might reduce the cost of wages for government workers, or the cost of goods that the government requires, for example, the military. Now, all of these measures carry significant costs. They're not free money. They're temporary solutions that carry future costs, but they allow you to finance the war in the here and now. And even then, it's not really the most extreme or only solution available. All of this presumes that the government wants to pay the war economy expenses with real money. Now, I know that might seem like an old-fashioned idea in this era of meme-based currencies, but it is what it is. You're trying to get your hands on real dollars from selling real assets or borrowing from your citizens or taking on international debts for which you receive real currency. But there is a third option available that has often proved irresistible to governments throughout time. Because if we can't get our hands on existing money, how about we just make more? Now, to grossly simplify the issue, if you've ever heard someone say that government should monetize the cost of a war or something else, What they mean is essentially that money printer should go brr. What government can do in a time-honoured tradition is essentially go to suppliers that it needs to purchase war material from, or go to the soldiers that it has to pay, print new money and hand it over and say thank you for your service. And unfortunately for economies throughout history, oftentimes there have been political leaders who discover that they have the ability to print money out of thin air and think they've discovered a cheat code. You can see the problem. The photo you can see on the right there is a World War II shot of a serviceman kneeling in a pile of what was colloquially called Japanese invasion money, where Japanese occupation authorities across Asia would print currency and issue it to local workers or businesses in exchange for their goods or services. As you can imagine, when these currencies were first issued, they didn't really have the value that they claimed to have, and when the Japanese were kicked out of these occupied areas, everyone who had had their goods or services taken in exchange for these notes found them to be completely worthless. Now, the damage done by this approach is 1, not immediate, and 2, tied to the level to which you do it. Most governments produce a certain amount of new currency every year during peacetime. A small positive inflation amount is considered a good thing for the economy. But if you're not careful, sooner or later you end up with people buying goods with wheelbarrows full of banknotes, or you find yourself issuing trillion-dollar notes. I believe Zimbabwe actually got to the point where they issued a $100 trillion note. But if you are at war, you might be tempted to go down this road anyway. The impact isn't immediate. Inflation takes a while to be felt. It takes a while for all of that money to wash through the economy and to drive up prices. So maybe we at the Department of Victory, since we need to pay our bills somehow, decide to break into the Treasury, seize the money printers, and let rip to our absolute heart's content. Problem solved, bonuses for everyone. Now, of course, doing all those things has created a slew of problems. We've now got crushing interest payments. We borrowed a bunch of money from overseas from the only people who had lended us, and they're lending to us at rates that would make a loan shark blush. Our infrastructure is beginning to degrade. Inflation is spiking because, money printer. We've devalued all of our businesses by forcing them to convert their deposits into our bonds, and there are shortages of critical goods and services in the economy. But we are the Department of Victory. We are not ready to give up, and so we can now illustrate another concept: the ability of government to temporarily paper over cracks in times of war. It's not just about the ability of war economies to raise funds when they need them. It's about the ability to temporarily solve all sorts of issues and defer those problems to the future. For example, let's just say our nation has gone to war and our currency is tanking. Maybe other countries have tried to attack confidence in our currency. Maybe we've run the money printer too hard. It doesn't matter. The currency is going down. Well, there's a range of interventions that we can use to push the currency back up. Capital controls are an obvious one. If the problem is that people are moving their money out of our country and converting it into foreign countries, well, let's just ban people moving money out of the country. And if people have foreign currency in our country, let's just say, for example, they're exporters that sell oil and gas overseas, well, we force them to take the US dollars or the euros that they have and convert a percentage of that into our currency. Russia's did this with the ruble, forcing exporters to convert a percentage of their earnings into rubles, pushing up demand for the ruble. You can do a currency buyback. You can take the foreign exchange reserves the government holds and use it to buy, again, hypothetically, the ruble, the way that Russians did. And the Russian central bank did other things as well. They spiked interest rates temporarily. This encourages people to keep their money in Russian banks because they're getting a more attractive interest rate for it. There are costs, obviously, particularly if you have borrowed money, if you have a mortgage, but it encourages you to keep your money in a Russian bank where you get 20% interest at that time, rather than pushing it overseas to an American bank or a European bank where you might get 1, 2, 3%. All of these options carry costs, but they're not costs that are felt immediately. Buying back the currency with foreign exchange probably has the most immediate cost. You lose the dollars or the euros or the yuan or whatever currency you're using to support the ruble. But things like capital controls or forced currency buybacks, those things just devalue the investments of others, not of the government. If you're forcing Gazprom, for example, to sell dollars and euros and buy rubles, you're supporting the currency, you're just devaluing Gazprom in the process. It doesn't cost the government anything immediately. And capital controls, well, those undermine future investment. No one's going to want to put their money into Russia in the future if they're worried at any moment the government might lock those funds up and prevent them leaving the country. But in the here and now, those approaches work. The Russian central bank responded quickly and decisively to the devaluation of the ruble. So much so, they arguably overcorrected, with the ruble going way beyond the level it was before the war. That was obviously supported by the shock in energy markets, which drove up the price of oil and gas, Russia's primary exports. So Russia was earning more foreign currency, there was more demand for the ruble, and as a result, the Russian ruble appreciated against the US dollar and the euro. None of those interventions are free, all of them have long-term costs, but in the here and now, they held the currency together. Or maybe we're short on certain critical resources. Electricity is a good example. We can't just convert more money into more electricity or import infinite amounts from it overseas. We're limited by our infrastructure and our generation capacity. Strategic commodities might be the same. Gasoline, for example. There's a variety of ways we can solve this problem. The easiest way probably is to constrain demand in a variety of ways. In Ukraine, you're looking at rolling blackouts to control demand for electricity and prevent the grid from being overloaded. In Europe, you're talking about discussions of gas rationing to make sure demand for gas doesn't go beyond the ability of the importing infrastructure to keep the continent fed. Rationing is often a wartime reality even in countries that produce an awful lot of a resource. The US was a major oil exporter during World War II. It was one of the major providers of fuel and gasoline to the Allies. It was one of the big advantages the Allied war machine had over the oil-poor Axis. But there was still gasoline rationing in America during World War II. You might get 2 to 3 gallons per week for personal use as an ordinary motorist, 8 gallons per week if you were a war worker and you were in a carpool. And if you were driving a truck or farm equipment, well, then you had unlimited gasoline because you were critical to the economy. The civilian fuel ration in Germany for just driving around and enjoying life, well, by the later stages of World War II, that was basically nil. If you're short on fuel during wartime, the monster truck rallies and NASCAR races probably have to wait. If you need yet more money and the money printer didn't solve your problems, well, there are even more ways that a country can raise additional finance. As things get more intense, you can move from simple taxation, money printing and borrowing, towards, at the extreme, outright appropriation. Maybe oligarchs start falling out of windows and their resources and assets are confiscated by the state, resold and used to fund the war effort. Maybe foreign companies that left your country find their assets confiscated, resold to Russian companies, and the proceeds used to fund the war effort. And changes to labour regulation and economic structures may also help. The head of the Russian central bank back in April warned that the economy of Russia would undergo a structural transformation in the third quarter of 2022. Laws and measures relating to economic mobilisation have been steadily introduced, and so we in the Department of Victory should consider taking inspiration from their methods. If foreign companies leave our country, well, their assets should be placed under our management or sold. And in terms of labour, well, holiday hours should probably be reduced and shifts increased. But for those of you doubters out there, you might think that inflation is still going to be a threat, even after all these measures. After all, we're running the money printer, we're producing fewer civilian goods, we've brought unemployment down because there are now plenty of jobs in the factory or the military. Surely we now have greater amounts of currency chasing fewer goods, and as a result, inflation is going to be out of control. Well, if you only care about economic fundamentals, then sure, inflation is probably going to be out of control. But we can distort economic fundamentals with temporary controls if we need to. We can, for example, just implement price controls which prevent firms increasing the price of goods by more than a certain percentage or above a certain point. If inflation is an increase in prices, well, let's just ban people increasing prices and that'll make the inflation go away. Russia and Ukraine have both discussed and implemented a range of price control measures over the last year in order to keep inflation in certain critical goods under control. Or in Russia, they've also discussed using price controls in order to make car cheapers to save the automotive industry because sales have fallen through the floor. It turns out that when people are really worried about their economic future and when the cost of production goes through the roof because of a reliance on imported components, the first thing that people preference in their budgets is usually not a brand new car. Now, some of you may have noticed the problem with this plan, which is that if you force businesses to sell a good for less than it's worth, they may not produce enough, or people might buy too much of it, and as a result, you end up with a situation where you have a shortage. But there's a variety of ways governments can intervene to temporarily solve that problem too. If there's too much demand relative to the supply, well, institute rationing, just ban people from buying more than a certain amount, and that'll solve the shortage problem. Or institute temporary subsidies to bring the cost of production down, or just use more price controls to bring the cost of inputs down in order to bring the cost of the final product down and make it cheaper. All of these measures are distortions. They come with a basic cost, but on a temporary basis, they can paper over the cracks, and they're not exclusively the domain of Russia or Ukraine. We tend to associate America with unvarnished capitalism, but during World War II, America had what was called the Office of Price Administration. The OPA was implemented in 1941, and it was so popular that it was only gutted a year after the war in 1946 and finally abolished in 1947. It implemented a maximum on a range of items. Implemented maximums on food, it controlled rental prices, it rationed everything from sugar to shoes, it could issue subsidies to balance out potential production shortfalls, and its goal, in which it was largely arguably successful, was keeping inflation under control in America during the war. And even though it was abolished in 1947, it was brought back in 1950 during the Korean War, just under a different name. These were never intended to be permanent measures, they were just intended to hold inflation and prices in check during a war to enable the war to be won, and then the consequences could be dealt with after the war. So if government and the Department of Victory has all of these mechanisms available to it to paper over the cracks, why can't the can be kicked down the road forever? Well, in some cases, it's not that the war economy collapses, it's that the military does. A country can just be overrun before its economy can meet the requirements before it, or the requirements may just have been impossible to meet in the first place. If the opposing army occupies all of your factories and seizes your productive resources, it really doesn't matter what financial state your government is in. You've probably lost. Or at the very least, you're preparing for an insurgency and a very different type of war. Second option might be a functional collapse. And these are only examples, but your nation might lose the ability to effectively fight, and you have to sue for peace or be overrun because you've lost the ability to provide some sort of critical input. Maybe, for example, you are completely out of oil and you've discovered that is essential to fight a modern war. Maybe you have no more ammunition production factories left and no ability to import it, and as a result, because pointy sticks are not particularly dominant on the modern battlefield, you are forced to surrender even if your army is still in the field. Alternatively, it might not be a critical input at all. It might just be that your entire economy has been vaporized, for example, through strategic bombardment, and as a result, you see the need to surrender. This may be because your factories have been physically destroyed, or maybe the government is just bankrupt. Another option might be capitulation or revolution, with capitulation being where the government decides to give up and revolution being where they don't, but the people decide to give up for them. The idea here is government has to make increasingly difficult choices to stave off economic collapse and carry on a war longer and longer, and eventually the population or the body politic hits a point where the decisions are so unpleasant that they're just not going to take it anymore. This doesn't necessarily mean the economy has collapsed. Russia in 1917 was in dire straits domestically. There would be a revolution, in fact there would be two, because the population was no longer willing to carry on the war. But if you look at the nation just through the lens of a spreadsheet, Russian war production up to the point of collapse in 1917 was actually really solid. If the people and the politicians had wanted to continue, the means existed to do it. It would have meant further declines in living conditions. It would have meant hunger for some Russians, but it was possible. And this and dozens of other examples throughout history make clear a very obvious truth. It's kind of hard to fight a war if no one is willing to fight it. So, Perun, you might ask, how close is Russia or Ukraine to any of those or other failure modes? Are there any signs that their war economies are going to collapse tomorrow? And just like last year, the answer is still no. The first thing to say is that to an extent, the Russian economy was prepared for something like this. It was in a bit of a rough shape in 2021. It was just coming out of COVID, which had caused something of a recession. But there'd been a lot of preparation to endure sanctions. The country had a structural surplus. There was a national wealth fund. There were significant foreign exchange reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of them. and there had been import substitution programs to protect parts of the economy from the prospect of being cut off from foreign imports. Russia was certainly not the wealthiest economy out there. Its GDP per capita was something like $12,000 in 2021, but it had saved up a lot of financial firepower for a rainy day. Doing so had a lot of opportunity costs for the Russian population and economy. Funds that were being saved up weren't being spent on regenerating infrastructure or improving living standards, but the country was, at least to some extent, prepared for war. Even looking just at Russian documents, we know that the war in Ukraine has been very expensive. The Russian economy, which should have grown if not for the war, has instead suffered something of a recession, even according to the Russian documents, although there's disagreement over just how much it has shrunk. Defense and national security spending has increased from about 24% of the federal budget to about a third of the stated budget, and the amount of spending on secret items has also increased significantly. Russia has gone from having a structural budget surplus, where the government takes in more money than it spends, to predicting a budget deficit of 2% of GDP in 2023, around 3 trillion rubles. Now, compared to deficits run by many other countries around the world, that's very tame. It's also a number that's based on some very optimistic assumptions. Russian budget documents presume the Russian economy is going to shrink much slower than most international observers think it's going to. And critically, it presumes an oil price, which is a critical source of Russian revenues, of $75 a barrel for Urals oil. That might be a tad optimistic, considering the G7 price cap is at $60 a barrel, and that at time of writing, the sales price started with a 5. In other words, it's entirely possible that 2023 ends up being more expensive for Russia than they predict. But not so much more that you'd expect the economy to have to go on life support. Russia responded to foreign sanctions, economic pressures, the loss of part of its hydrocarbon market with a variety of measures that I've talked about before. Forced currency conversions, capital control, manipulation of interest rates, stimulus spending, monetary expansion, a focus on an eastern economic pivot where it pushes more of its hydrocarbons and other exports to countries like India and China, and also massive profit-taking from the energy disruption period in the EU. So during that period where gas and oil prices spiked as a result of Russia's own war, well, Russia was still selling energy and as a result getting a much higher price for its goods, which ran up massive profits for companies like Gazprom, and then Russia essentially, as the major shareholder of Gazprom, withdrew that money to put it against the Russian budget. That's a bit of a simplification, but it captures the core idea. I'll do an update video on the Russian economy at some point, but the core point is that Russian central bankers and economic institutions responded pretty quickly and pretty decisively to stabilize the economy in the wake of sanctions. And Russia still has a range of options available to it before things get truly desperate. The country's not under embargo, it's under sanctions. Sanctions increase cost, they make it more difficult to access imports, they don't make things impossible. People keep expressing surprise every time a Western component is discovered in a piece of Russian military hardware. Frankly, I don't think we should actually be surprised. If you're talking about dual-use technology like chips, it's kind of hard to prevent, for example, technology being sold to a third party, repurchased, smuggled across a border, and then deployed. What the sanctions achieve is a reduction in the quantity and also making that good much more expensive. From the reporting that is out there about the Iranian drones in Russian service, for example, many observers note that the Shahed drones should cost about $20,000 or $30,000 but that's not what Russia is paying for them. Between the alleged shipments of top-of-the-line Russian fighter jets, payments in cash, Western weapons, Iran is taking Russia to the cleaners in terms of the markup on the Shahed 136. And they can afford to do it because Russia is under sanctions and doesn't have many other options. But as long as Russia is willing to pay the price, sanction busting can likely continue. And the Russian government has additional options available to it as well, some that it has already shown its hand on. Regionalising costs, for example, asking regional governments to pay the cost to raise volunteer units, in quotes, and send them to war in Ukraine. Extracting special dividends out of companies like Gazprom or charging resource producers like fertilizer and coal producers one-time payments to help stabilise the budget. That's privatisation of costs. And should things, for whatever reason, ever get truly desperate in a fiscal sense, Well, the money printer is available, as is a whole bunch of domestic savings by Russian civilians, who, for example, could be required to convert their deposits into war bonds or something similar. So the question for the Russian economy, separating it from the war effort itself and how many tanks or planes and guns and shells it can produce, but in terms of a sustainability sense, the real question is not, is Russia going to run out of money? Russia is very unlikely to run out of money because it has a huge range of mechanisms it can use to pull together finance if it needs to. The real question is, what level of decreased living standards are Russians willing to accept? What level of decrease in social infrastructure, potentially in pensions, compulsory war bond purchases, increased inflation? What sort of pain is the average member of the Russian public willing to endure in order to allow the Ukraine war to continue? And the biggest determinant of how quickly those costs will mount is what happens to the price and the volumes for Russia's primary exports, oil and gas. But whatever the price, Russia still has financial resources available to it, and if, for example, it thinks that Ukraine might eventually be cut off from Western aid, say, for example, the ongoing race for Speaker of the House in the United States ends up giving them hope that Ukraine will eventually be cut off, then they do have these unpopular and painful measures available to them that will allow them to tide the economy over for a long while yet. But just because Russia still has financial firepower left doesn't mean that Ukraine is likely to collapse anytime soon either. The country was predicted to suffer something like a 40-45% GDP contraction in 2022. Being invaded is a fairly traumatic experience. Depending on the source you look at, it looks like the actual figure has been closer to 30-35% than 40-45%. Predictions for 2023 actually range from, on the low end, a 2.5% additional contraction, all the way up to a 6% rebound. And a large part of the reason this is possible is because the Ukrainian budget assumes that the vast majority of its financing requirements for the war will be met externally, that is, through foreign aid and foreign loans. And so far, that seems very likely to be true if you look at the amount of financial assistance provided for in recent EU decisions that's likely to come from the IMF and that was contained in the budget bill the US pushed through before the new Congress was seated. The civilian population is likely to have degraded living standards. We've seen that already, but as discussed in the strategic bombing video, that doesn't mean the Ukrainian civilian population is going to be prepared to give up. As long as the West stands with Ukraine, well, the Ukrainian economy can be stabilized. Although I will note the quality of administration in that country is going to matter greatly. That is, the quality of economic management in Ukraine may make a big difference on what the impact on Ukrainian civilians turns out to be. In conclusion, unless you have enough military power that you can just overrun a country or completely cut it off from a key input like oil or food, wearing down a national economy to defeat it by attrition is usually a very difficult prospect. Reducing GDP is seldom enough. You need to wear down capital of all kinds. And even under the hardest conditions, governments can usually paper over the cracks for a while, taking on new debt, printing money, implementing a whole bunch of temporary economic controls to hold the thing together for months or even years. This war has been economically ruinous for Russia. The economy has been jolted from rapid growth to decline. The federal budget has gone from surplus to deficit, capital and human outflows have been immense, and long-term access to foreign investment, foreign technology, and key foreign markets are up in the air. The full impact of those costs will only play out over time, and in the meantime, the war factories can keep producing. Ukraine is suffering as well, with many citizens pinning their hopes on a future of foreign-funded reconstruction and European economic integration. But in the here and the now, there's very little choice but to go on. There is no willingness at all to accept Russian territorial demands. And as long as Western support continues to flow and the population holds together, then Ukraine too can go on. And it's precisely because neither side is likely to suffer any sort of imminent economic collapse that battlefield outcomes and weapons supply are going to be so critical. And why next week we're going to look at the performance and supply of one critical class of weapon system. Okay, brief channel update to close out. First of all, Happy New Year, everyone. Let's hope that 2023 is a little more positive overall than 2022 was. I'm moving back to my regular release schedule, so expect videos to land on Sundays, very occasionally Saturdays. The Fridays are a little bit of an anomaly to accommodate some of the holidays. From a channel perspective, there will be new things to announce in the coming weeks, but for the moment, I'm just taking a week or two slightly slowly to regenerate a little bit, and we'll be back with a new sense of momentum in weeks to come. Thank you very much for your support as always, and I will see you next week.